Greetings, people all over the world, all 5 of you. In my previous videos, number 1 and number 2A, I talked about how I did a lot of research and I studied and I thought and I got a headache and I came up with my own scale system. All right, I talked about that, and I ended up with a foundational structure that I use in my system called a scale phrase. And I had 8 basic scale phrases. These are the ones I have. All right, and then I had 8 unusual scale phrases. I mentioned that. But I thought about it, and I was wondering if young students or people with no musical background might have thought, you know what, Joey, you introduced too many weird ideas and concepts and too much weird stuff, so I got confused and I didn't quite get it. So let me quickly go over this again and see if I can make it perfectly clear. I mentioned that I went all the way back to ancient Greece and I found a seminal musical structure. In other words, I found an original musical structure. All right, it was a group of tones. And it was more specifically 4 successive tones. Okay, I mentioned that, and I showed you what they called a tetrachord, 4 tones. All right, and we see clearly, right from the beginning, that we do indeed have 4 successive tones. All right, and we see from E to B, from E down to B, we have 5 half steps. That's an interval of a perfect fourth. And I mentioned that maybe they get the idea of intervals from Pythagoras, but they got it from somebody, and that's what they chose. Then we also see that we have a descending order of pitch. We have the highest tone here and the lowest tone here. All right. Now we also saw that there was different combinations or configurations of half steps, whole steps, and or 3 half steps. Now I need to switch charts to show you that. I did show you this. These were the original Greek tetrachords. And you see here that in each tetrachord, it extends from E down to B. All right, each one's the same. And each one is indeed 4 successive tones. So the only difference, and this is how they got the names for these, the only difference is the choice of the 2 inner tones, you see? And the choice of the 2 inner tones determines the intervals between the tones of the tetrachord, right? I might have failed to mention that. For example, the name diatonic is derived from the fact that these 2 inner tones, the ones that were chosen, create these intervals, and the chromatic name is derived from the fact that these 2 tones were chosen, and we have different intervals. Then you have the enharmonic tetrachord, and that's different also. But see, I don't include this in my system. I don't use it because you see you have tiny intervals. That's a quarter step, and these might be referred to in some systems as microtonal. For example, in Indian or Middle Eastern music, they would use these smaller intervals. But in Western music, like in mostly for Europe and the United States, we wouldn't be using these intervals. First of all, these are too small, and this interval is too large. This is equivalent, 4 half steps, that's equivalent to 2 whole steps. So that's just too large. Anyway, the point is, they basically got their names for their tetrachords from the resultant intervals that were created between the tones of the tetrachord. All right, so that, I think that should be clear. And then when they got to the Middle Ages, many years later, music theorists decided, you know what, we like the order of tones to go up in pitch. For example, there's your old tetrachord, but the Middle Age people said, you know what, let's go up in pitch. And then here's another one, 4 tones. This, in fact, this tetrachord you could call it a Dorian, because 2 of these tetrachords combined formed the Dorian mode, one of the very, very, very first modes. And then two of these tetrachords combined will give you the Phrygian mode. Anyway, ascending order of pitch was the beautiful innovation, all right? So I wanted to repeat that, review that. So I created what I called the scale phrase, but to do it I had to keep some old ideas, and I had to consider those ideas for inclusion. What do I want to include in my system? And of course, what do I want to scrap? What do I want to get rid of? So I ended up with this. I ended up with 4 successive tones. Okay, we got that from the Greek theorists. Then I chose the ascending order of pitch, which we received from the Middle Age theorists. Okay, ascending order of pitch. Then, for the scale phrase, unlike the tetrachord, which required from first to last tone 5 half steps total, for the scale phrase system, I decided to make an innovation, to introduce an innovation. That scale phrase can be 4 to 6 half steps. It can be 4, 5, or 6 half steps and still maintain its integrity as a scale phrase. Now the beautiful thing is, by extending the range of half steps, that facilitates multiple new half, whole, or 3 half-step interval configurations. In other words, that gives you the ability to use configurations combining any of these. That's the beautiful thing. I don't know if I made that clear before, but I think that should be clear now. All right? This is what happened. This is what I ended up with. Now, to show you an example, we go back again, and we see that the Greeks gave us the concept of the diatonic tetrachord, but the diatonic, the term, the whole concept was based on the intervals between the tones, specifically because of the 2 inner tones that were chosen. So the diatonic, meaning we can use an odd or even half-step configuration. Here's a single half-step, that's odd, and here's your whole step, that's 2 half-steps. In other words, that's an even number of half-steps. So the diatonic basically means you can use whole or half-steps in your scale phrase or tetrachord. Right? Then the chromatic signified that you had 2 different middle tones, and that the result was you had different intervals in between those tones. And here we have the old chromatic tetrachord, but now we have the ascending order of pitches. Now it's called a scale phrase because it's more flexible, it's better, it's improved. And here you have 3 half steps. That's an odd number. You have 1 odd and 1 odd. So basically the chromatic tetrachord had odd only half steps. Odd only. So now when you get to the scale phrase, when you put it all together, okay, when you put all this good stuff together here, you kind of end up with this. The scale phrase system, which we'll get into. We'll show you how to make scales. And in the scale phrase system, here you would have your 4 successive tones. That's pretty clear. You have ascending order of pitch, and you have your 2 middle tones that were chosen, and you have the resulting intervals. Now here you see immediately that we get to combine the chromatic concept of intervals with the diatonic concept of intervals with the chromatic. I said that backwards. See, we combined this with this, and we got a really nice scale phrase here. It has a whole, half, and 3 half-step interval in there. Then also here's another scale phrase. This is C to F, and in my system this would be called the harmonic scale phrase. And you have a half step, 3 half steps, and another half step. So you have great flexibility because of the combinations of intervals, whether they be odd or even. So now I think that should be clear. And in the next few videos, I'm going to show you how I combine these. I'll just give you a few examples because if I did every scale, it would take forever. And then you'll have an idea of how we put the two scale phrases together. They make nice scales, and I think if you learn this when you're a child, as soon as you're a brand new student, I think it'd be easier to learn and retain. So that's it. Thanks for being patient, and I hope to see you soon. Good night.